we're here for a very special event which celebrates Penguin Classics' launch of 4 books that are sort of established Asian American classics, and we'll be discussing 3 of the books in more detail. But the books might actually seem a little strange to you because I think many of us are used to Asian American literature as something that's actually a very recent phenomenon. So how many of you in this room are an immigrant or your parents immigrated here? Probably like later than the 60s. So pretty much almost everyone. I mean, I would raise my hand to that. So the idea that there is literature before 1965 by Asian Americans is almost impossible to imagine. I mean, my parents came here after 1965. And it's one of these things where people always think about what is political art? Like, do you have to write, you know, agitprop? Do you have to have it be didactic? What does it mean to engage with political issues? But the very fact that any of you are in this room, I mean, almost the entire room raised their hands, and the idea that books could be produced, it's actually the result of immigration law and the 1965 Civil Rights Act, in that it would be impossible for most of us to be in this room if not for these laws having passed to allow, you know, border travel. But what these 4 books do is they offer something different, which is actually the fact that, believe it or not, there were books by Asian Americans before Amy Tan's The Joy Luck Club, which I think for many people is sort of like the first book, not by an Asian American, but the first book in the Asian American marketing category. So that's sort of what we're going to discuss tonight. Each of our 3 illustrious readers will read a brief passage. And I guess before we start, I want to thank Penguin Classics for their work on this series. And you know, in addition to these books, there have been a number of new books featuring writers of color, queer writers, as well as writers in Asia, like Jose Rizal, to name just one. I also want to highlight the fact that these 4 books were originally published by 2 other presses, which were Kaya Press and the University of Washington, which published No No Boy and America's in the Heart. And both of these presses have a long-standing commitment to Asian American literature, and I think this process shows the importance of a project like Asian American literature or the Asian American Writers Workshop as a kind of ecology, where it's very important for a small press like Kaya or an academic press like the University of Washington to be there taking the risks, publishing the writers, being in the community, and then you all can be here and read the fruits of their labor. And so, you know, I want to encourage you all to check out Kaya, check out University of Washington, buy their books, see what other Asian American classics are out there that you might not be aware of. So, all that being said, I will stop being a blowhard. And so first, I'm delighted to have all 3 writers here. And as I mentioned, this is probably the last AWW event I'll ever introduce after 11 years. So it's a kind of cool full circle since we're dealing with books from sort of the prehistory of Asian American identity. And it's great to have these 3 writers here, like all of whom I met probably around right when I started here, and have had like a really long history with the organization that predates my being here even. So first of all, Alex Chee will be discussing Younghill Kang's classic East Goes West. As you all know, Alex is the author of several books, including Edinburgh, Queen of the Night, How to Write an Autobiographical Novel, as well as the winner of a Whiting Award and a number of other fellowships and awards. Younghill Kang's book is published in 1937 as a picaresque satire. It's a book that deals with being in America, but also, for all of you fans of pachinko, the state of being a Korean refugee after Japanese colonialism. It's an immigrant novel that explains Korea to America, but also tries to investigate what America could be. As Alex writes in his beautiful intro, it's a call to action, a call for the country to live up to the dream it has of itself. Let's give Alex a hand.
Hi. I wanted to just quickly acknowledge something about Ken's time here at the workshop. For those of us who have the long view on the workshop, we've seen it grow enormously in terms of its cultural position in New York City and in the world at large. And it's been a pleasure to watch these programs that he instituted take on these powerful lives and start transforming the world, whether it's the fellowship program or the magazine, any number of these initiatives, the event series, Ken's vision of the workshop as an Asian American centered approach to the culture at large, I think has been one that has given us a great deal. So, thank you. So one of the things that I should say up front about this book is that it was interesting for me to read and see how many of Younghill Kang's problems were the same as my own. And by interesting, I mean like choking back a certain amount of horror. He came here after he was a part of the March 1st movement in Korea, which, if you aren't familiar with it, it's a really important event politically, where these Koreans came together to non-violently protest the way that the Japanese occupation was dealing with Koreans, the police control specifically of the country. And I mean, there's a lot that was being protested. It's a very simplistic approach. But in any case, the Japanese violently attacked the protesters. Many were killed, and many were thrown in jail, including Younghill Kang. And he was helped out of the country by by some American missionaries who were one of them was translating Paul Bunyan into Korean, and he was helping her, and they got him to Canada, and then from Canada into the U.S., and that is how he came to be here with us. When he applied for his Guggenheim to write this novel in 1933, he described himself as a stateless person, and he felt that the country that he knew from growing up had been destroyed by the Japanese. And so he writes this novel from that position, which is a really intense encounter with this history that I was simply unprepared for. And it's also the kind of framing that he gives his narrator in this book, who he's named Chung Pa-han. And I was trying to think of what to read from, and I thought I would read from so Chung Pa comes to the U.S. Much as he did. There's a lot of similarities between his life and Chung Pa's, but it really is a novel, and it's a novel about a young Asian American poet in New York, Asian immigrant poet in New York, and in that I saw a lot of myself, a lot of my friends. It was an intense experience for me to read this. Maybe you'll find it the same way. The cover is sort of looks like me, my giant round head, and it's based on the original cover, which I love this. I love this cover so much. So he's just arrived in New York. He's tried to apply for a job. The person told him that he could not hire either a Negro or an Oriental, and so he's got almost no money. He manages to get a meal at a Chinese restaurant in Chinatown, where he learns that the Chinese restaurants there had the tradition back then of making the shift meal a little larger than they needed to in case someone was hungry. A brother was hungry, as they put it in the book. So he goes to find someone named George Jum, who was, the rest is pretty self-explanatory. The next period of my life must properly be dedicated to George Jum. He attempted to be my teacher in things American, and certainly he had left all Asian culture behind as a thing of naught. If I am not a very shining example of his precepts, the faults must be laid to me and not to him. Yes, even that first endless and helpless period of mine had a help and came to an end, for Jum appeared at last. The evening before my rescue, in a restless misery I could not bring myself to re-enter my dreary little room. I had eaten well in the Chinese restaurant, and this food had revitalized me with a nervous energy. All night I prowled on tireless padded feet like a creature caged. Central Park I reached at 59th Street, just as the sun was stealing up and the dews slipped down. The patient trees of winter spread their arms more hopefully as the sun washed off the night dirt, showing the dust crystals in the blue and violet light. The homeless bum sat up on the bench. Another day had begun. Milk wagons, street cleaners, policemen, and now the sun, well risen, was splashing the facade of George Jum's house with a strong, cheerful light. It was 8:30, no longer too early to call and inquire once more. So he's been trying to connect to George, and George has just not been home. What a change in the Hungarian fat lady. She was all warm personal interest and smiles now. This is the maid of George. He expects you. Go right up. Mr. Jum came home. Through the warm, steam-heated house hovered a morning incense of American breakfast bacon and a Korean or Hungarian odor of garlic, too. Probably Hungarian, for George disliked garlic now. He was so sophisticated. He's on the 3rd floor. You'll see his name on the door. Go right up, Mr. Han. And she encouraged me with many nods and waves of her pudgy hands before disappearing through a long curtain in the hall below. Before I had finished the first knock, George Jum jumped out. Han! Chungpa! Son of a gun! Why didn't you write you were coming? Then I would be here, he exclaimed jovially in English. How long have you been in New York? How are you? Come straight in. What is the news from the homeland? George Jum looked very Americanized in his red leather slippers and a bathrobe of heavy striped black and gray necktie silk. Even now, when he had just risen from bed with hair not combed or parted, but all streaked down, he had a fresh, debonair appearance. His forehead was smooth and marble white, without a scratch. His eyes were a light black and always dancing with a smile. His nose was round, well-shaped, only being too round. It looked better in profile. Sorry, there's this... Chungpa is very judgmental about appearances. He had a demure, independent grin. His figure was neat, his movements rapid as those of a cat after a mouse. And as he pushed me into the room before him, he was very cordial and seemed to have known me always, not just by mail. This is my room. You're welcome here. Not bad. Large enough to have a small dancing party in it. It is all yours. This house is practically private, except for the black kitten, which is very seldom seen. But the lady, Mrs. Flo, is seen once in a while. She has very good whiskey when I have a cold. There is a couch, and this is the bed. Choose which you will have. The door leads to the closet. And he opened it to show me. It was neatly filled up with shoes, hats, suits, overcoats. They all belong to you, I asked incredulously. Oh, yes, but nothing unusual. When I start work again, I will buy more. This door leads to the bathroom. Perhaps you will want to wash up. Where have you been staying these last few days when I wasn't in New York to show you how to do things? Oh, you have a bathtub, too. Luxurious, I exclaimed, too busy looking to reply. My landlady in Little Italy had no bathtub. Sure, said George. That is nothing. In New York it is necessary, not luxury, where dirt is common property. He came in after me and said he would instruct me in how to do things, how to use things. I looked at George's bathroom shelf. I had never in my life before seen so many things to be put on the human body. The hair, the teeth, the face. What's this? And this? I marveled. George shaved and I watched him do it. So I would know how, he said. He washed hands and face first, then he rubbed his shaving paste with his shaving brush, making a lather. Then he put his brush to his face, and for a minute was lost in foam. After that he shaved in rapid strokes, up and down. It's a good razor, the kind that never cuts, Unless you have a pimple or some kind of extra pointed out flesh. Yes, sharp, but it does not matter how if it cuts, because I have a pencil. He showed it to me. It's a white pencil that can't write. Then what's it for? To use in place of sea glue, of course. You mean it stops bleeding? Yes, said George, and he purposely cut down a small pimple to make it bleed, and held up the pencil. You see, this is the way. Later he put some perfumed water, smelling like spring flowers, on his face, and last some cream-colored powder out of a round box with a black-haired gentleman's head on it. Powder on face! George grinned. Ladies have to grease it first, which I don't. He took out a clean white shirt and freshly pressed pants. A fast worker he was, I noted. In a minute he was fully dressed, while, fascinated, I still prepared to take a bath at George's instruction. George came in just then to comb his hair. I turned the bathtub on and the shower ran down over everything. For God's sake, turn that off! I meant to turn it off, but it came on more vigorously. I don't know how! George turned off the shower and unloosened a rosy-colored bath curtain looking beautifully fresh and new. He told me to get in there. When I got in, he closed the curtains. Now you can turn the water. It was marvelous, like being inside a flower. Water came down as if it were harnessed rain, a tropical rain, but I could make it as cold as I wished. George said either polar or tropical. Down it ran, over my hair, face, body. That was wonderful, I exclaimed, coming out. Never a bath again, only a shower. But poor George, I had made him all wet. He had taken off his pants and was examining them. These will have to be pressed. Hell to it. He saw my worried look and reassured me. That's easy. I have an electric iron. Anyhow, it is better to cook without the pants. Sorry, I love this so much. He gave me the American dressing gown, and he himself tied the girdle around my waist. He pointed out to me the red leather slippers. Where are these? Then he said, now we shall have breakfast. Wait, it flows too much. It moves. He was referring to the long white shirt in which he was still clothed, although without the pants. The reason I put this on, and he put on his vest, leaving his neat, compact legs bare, down to his garters and socks. Now I will show you the American breakfast. The kitchen was a big cabinet in George's bedroom. When open, it was a little alcove, very complete, with small electric icebox, gas stove, dish, cupboard, etc. When you got through, as George explained, everything folded back and you closed the doors. He took down a loaf of bread. Grandmother's, said George with a wink, in reference to the wrapper around the bread. George winked slowly. It was the only thing he did slowly. But winking is difficult for a Korean unless he practices it very much in youth. George cut the slices very thick, trimmed off all the crust, and prepared to make toast. He balanced himself this way and that, watching everything without appearing to do so. When he took cups and saucers down, he made the cups turn a somersault, catching them in midair. The knife he juggled, whirling it 3 times round before cutting the grapefruit with one stroke, and then taking out all seeds at once with one motion of the grapefruit jack. He poured in powdered sugar quickly. He buttered the toast, smoking hot, until each piece was soft clear through. Coffee, too, was ready by this time. Be seated, said George with a bow. Over the breakfast, I told George my troubles since arriving in New York, how he pitied me, especially since I had walked up to his house so many times. Good Lord, I wouldn't do that for anything, unless a beautiful girl accompanied me, or I got paid for it. I said it was good training. I would have to know New York if I meant to live here and find a job. All my optimism and assurance had come back with George. Well, don't worry about not having any money, advised George. Not in New York, which is wealthier than all of Asia. Tonight we will go to Chinatown and pull out some lottery. Later I will teach you how to cook. As a cook, I can boast myself an artist. The wages of a good cook are $50 a week with board, room, and laundry. Better than a bank clerk or college instructor, you will find. And it's much better money than when I was an ambassador for the Korean government in Washington, D.C. Your food service stuff explained. But I don't know the spoken language very well yet. You must speak only English with me so I can learn. Sure, said George genially. I like to speak English. I myself know how to employ the idiom. Now I lay back on George's bed, comfortably stretching in the sun-filled room. The luxury of being here was almost too much. I loved the effect of space after narrow, tortuous, dark Chinatown. 2 double windows opened toward Central Park, and there was besides a smaller window in a side wall. White net muted the light. There was some kind of artificial Persian rug on the floor. 2 cheap Western pictures were hung, one with 3 shepherd dogs' heads with tongues hanging out, another a Maxfield Parrish print of a girl with bare legs sitting against a romantic blue. My eyes traveled from the big desk with 3 drawers at the bottom and a row of books at the top, all brand new bindings, to a dressing table very neatly kept. On it were George's father's and mother's and brother's pictures, and another in an ornate silver frame of a blonde Western girl. George had shut up the kitchen and was busy with his pants and a big steel cake. He pressed a button as he explained, and electricity made it hot enough to press the pants, which were laid across a cloth-wrapped board held up by 2 chairs. George put a wet cloth over the pants and pressed hard. Better than the stick our mothers used, huh? This line has got to be exactly straight. You see? That is it. Girls don't like it if it's not. I asked George if he was thinking of getting married, that he took such pains. I am thinking of love, not of marriage, said George. Marriage from love is vinegar from wine, as the poet says. I'm sorry, I'm really enjoying Jessica in the front row. I have done a lot of thinking on this subject. Marriage as an institution here is a failure because it is a law-abiding. Anything that law commands in the form of thou shalt not, that thing man wants more. That is the symbol of this Western civilization. Man makes laws, and laws make his wants more complicated. If the law says you should have 1 wife, then you want more than 1. If the law says live with the same woman, then you want to try different ones. Isn't that funny? That's human nature, just like the wild ducks. They are monogamous in their wild nature and become polygamous as soon as domesticated. The guinea fowl does the same. That is, civilization depraves the birds and the animals as well as man. But then civilization is a good thing. We enjoy motor cars and bathtubs. And who would not want having more than 1 wife? I would rather choose civilization and more than 1 woman than go back to wildlife and marry 1 woman for life. Let us never forget, we owe all this pleasure to the progress of civilization. It is because nude women are prohibited on the streets that the beautiful half-naked women dancing on the gymnasium floor under deep-colored lights of soft evening are beautiful, or the 3/4 naked woman by the seashore under a glowing summer sky. Man makes laws, and sometimes law does help psychologically. I let George see that I was interested. Willingly, he spoke more on the same subject. I don't believe anybody in New York has gone around with more girls than I have. Still, I have more to find out about them. I make a study of them. It's the greatest line of research in the West. You know, women are funny and different, and you have to treat them accordingly. They do not have the same psychology that we do. Sooner or later, they will get mad. Watch out for that. The man who said he couldn't get on without them or with them seems to have understood them, so that is the best thing, to make the best out of them. Now pants are done. He asked me what I thought of the picture on his dressing table. All right, but the girl is very fat. George got into his pants. They fitted him to perfection. He was evidently very careful about his clothes, yet he never looked stiff. That picture is the most deceiving thing in the world, he said warmly, taking it up to examine. She is much better looking than that. I met her 5 years ago in Washington, D.C. When you were ambassador? Washington, George sighed. What a place for beautiful girls. The job alone counts. I was in love with her for 2 years. Now we write to each other, that is all. It's sad. If you don't like her, I'll change the picture. And he brought out the photo of a girl in Cossack boots and a Russian dancing dress. I fell into a gentle slumber, exhausted by my efforts in reaching the real America at last. When I awoke, George was sitting at his desk. Beautiful notepapers of various kinds were spread out before him. There was monogram paper with the initial of his last name very large and the initial of his first name very small inside. There was paper with his name written in gold and beautiful Chinese characters, and there was a third kind with the Korean national flower at the top, in color. What are you doing? I said. Writing letters. Very boring, I said. Letter writing has always seemed to me a waste of time. My, how I hate it. That is because you have never been in love. Letter writing is actually important in the art of love. Sometimes a letter can do more than actual meeting, especially if the letter is a suggestive one. That's where art comes in. Confucius does not list love among the different branches of the arts and knowledge. Does he list cooking? But isn't cooking an art? And so is love. They are much the same. Each requires the highly skilled master, and each gives pleasure in its own way. Confucius, I admit, has nothing to teach on the subject of love. That's where I leave him behind, for love is the beginning of a real, new, true life leading you into the garden of paradise, maybe Eden. It's a pity that in English they say falling in love. It's not a falling, but it is a rising. If it is a falling action, you will have no more life. Because it is a rising action, you will get more done. But maybe in English they have a more ironic attitude toward love than I have. Are you writing to that girl? I asked idly, indicating the new photograph. George thought a bit and then shook his head. What I have written is too good for her. Besides, it is in Korean. What will you do with it then? I will save it. Very often what I write is too good to send right away. He opened a drawer in his desk. See, these are all kinds of love letters for various occasions. Some are finished. Some roughly sketched, some only once revised. They are in English, Korean, and Chinese. I write them as they come into my head. Then, when I am in a hurry or need to act with sudden inspiration, I select from these. I saw he got this idea from the Orient, where the village scribe used to keep on hand certain especially good letters for birthday greetings, or for partings, or congratulations on the birth of a son. Then he rented them out as they were called for, always careful to keep the copy. But what a pity I have written this letter in Korean, said George, shaking his head. Not many beautiful Korean girls can get away from Korea to come over here. I don't know any. They all get married too young when they are beautiful, now that the men are becoming civilized over there. But I'll put it away for my ideal. And he told me that he also had an ideal imaginary girl to whom he wrote regularly, posting her letters in a certain drawer. Why not translate? I suggested after reading George's letter. All right, and I will help you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Alex. Next, we have the great Jessica Hagedorn talking about Carlos Bulosan's classic, America is in the Heart. Jessica needs no introduction. Her many books include, obviously, Dog Eaters, a National Book Award finalist, Gangster of Love, and Toxicology. And she's the winner of a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Asian American Writers Workshop, though she has many lives left to come. And I was instructed that if there's one thing I should mention, I should say that you should all see Felix Starro, which is a new musical that she's involved with, based on a story by Leslie Tenorio. So please get your theater scheduling book ready. So she's going to be talking about Carlos Bulosan, which I think is probably like the most famous pre-1965 Asian American book. There's a book, there's a not at all famous Asian American short called Asian American Jesus by Samantha Chance. And there's a scene where there's an Asian American studies professor talking from her desk. And the three books on her desk are Carlos Bulosan, Lisa C's Immigrant Acts, and Racial Formation. And it's sort of like an in-joke if you've ever taken no one cares. Okay. Carlos Bulosan was described by Carrie McWilliams as the premier text of the Filipino American experience. It's sort of like a Grapes of Wrath, a rural cultural front novel about migrant farm workers, if Steinbeck had written about American colonialism in the Philippines. Let's give Jessica a hand.
I'm short. Thank you. I want to echo kudos to Ken, bravos to Ken. I'm going to miss you, comrade. I mean, this man has supported so many writers and come up with great ideas for events and programs and has managed to keep this place thriving. For how long have you been here? 11 beautiful years, and I've gotten to know him, and we went out with a culture strike to Arizona, and I mean, it's really great. I think it's time for you to write your next book, but we are going to miss you, us folks, and we thank you for all you've done for all of us, really. He's going to get weepy now, but I mean, we need to acknowledge this, okay? Because this came suddenly. I mean, you know. Talking about Bulosan, well, you know what's so interesting? Last night, I was hanging with another writer named Gina Apostol. And boy, we were talking about this book, and we were talking about how you had to come to this country. The Filipinos in the Philippines, I'm going to make a big generalization, know his short stories, Carlos's short stories, but this book, because it's really about America, isn't really read or studied back in the Philippines. And so when I got to San Francisco as a very young person, and I started hearing about him because he's really an icon in California. And I felt so stupid. I'd be like, what? Who is this guy? And, you know, people would be shocked, like, why don't you know about him? Blah, blah, blah. I mean, I immigrated in 1963, so you can imagine I was totally ignorant, right? So I read the book when I was very young, and I love what Elaine Castillo has to add to the conversation, and her talking about finding the book in the library and really being stunned. And kind of rereading this book for tonight's event, I was blown away by what a magnificent writer this man is. I mean, you can just read this because it's great literature. I mean, the writing is kind of mind-boggling. And his life, it's an autobiographical novel, so, you know, I'm sitting there going, oh, yeah, this really happened to him. You know, it kind of really follows his life, like you're talking about Younghill Kang. This George probably really existed and all of that. I mean, what a character. And I know that this follows the trajectory a lot of us know about how Carlos got involved with the union, and, you know, this man suffered every 5 minutes. Something horrible happened to him. So I'm glad you started this reading, because here we go. Yeah, fun and funny. And while I found Carlos Bulosan to be very, how he never got super angry in his writing also boggles the mind. I mean, he just observes, and he observes beautifully, and these terrible, cruel things happen to him and his comrades. And, you know, he survives it in this amazing way. And his life was difficult. He was accused of plagiarism later in life and sort of looked down upon as a writer. And he died of tuberculosis in Seattle. I mean, really pretty much a broken person and forgotten. And I'm glad this beautiful book is being reissued with a beautiful new cover. And I really hope all these writers that Penguin is presenting in a new way get the attention they deserve. I mean, even though they're all dead, it's important that we're looking at these classics, not just as classics, but as something to be read now, and that it's very alive right now, and it really makes a hell of a lot of sense to read America's in the Heart now, because nothing much has changed, really. I mean, you could pick anything here, and it would read well. That's how good of a writer he is. But this is when he leaves one town. He's coming from Stockton, and he's going to another place. He's been told to leave Stockton. I think it's self-explanatory. The narrator is named Alos, but really it's Carlos. I began to be afraid, riding alone in the freight train. I wanted suddenly to go back to Stockton and look for a job in the tomato fields, but the train was already traveling fast. I was in flight again, away from an unknown terror that seemed to follow me everywhere. Dark flight into another place, toward other enemies. But there was a clear sky, and the night was ablaze with stars. I could still see the faint haze of Stockton's lights in the distance, a halo arching above it and fading into a backdrop of darkness. In the early morning, the train stopped a few miles from Niles in the midst of a wide grape field. The grapes had been harvested, and the bare vines were falling to the ground. The apricot trees were leafless. 3 railroad detectives jumped out of a car and ran toward the boxcars. I ran to the vineyard and hid behind a smudge pot, waiting for the next train from Stockton. A few bunches of grapes still hung on the vines, so I filled my pockets and ran for the tracks when the train came. It was a freight, and it stopped to pick up carloads of grapes. When it started moving again, the empties were full of men. I crawled to a corner of a car and fell asleep. When I awakened, the train was already in San Jose. I jumped outside and found another freight going south. I swung aboard and found several hobos drinking cans of beer. I love how he observes these people, and his empathy is so profound. And this goes throughout the novel. So it's really something that hit me this time around, his sort of huge heart. I swung aboard and found several hobos drinking cans of beer. I sat and watched them sitting solemnly as though there were no more life left in the world. They talked as though there were no more happiness left, as though life had died and would not live again. I could not converse with them, and this barrier made me a stranger. I wanted to know them and to be a part of their life. I wondered what I had in common with them beside the fact that we were all on the road, rolling to unknown destinations. And I'm going to keep interrupting myself because I know you all must get these books and read them yourselves. But things occur to me, like how many people have tried to make a movie out of this man's book, and it doesn't work. You know, it's almost too good. Or tried to make a play or whatever, and it's almost like the book stands alone, and it's the world he creates, and it's every time you try to there's so much drama here already, and so much love and empathy and gentleness, and it just breaks your heart reading it. I'm getting really emotional, okay? So he got funny, I'm getting emotional. The race thing. When I reached Salinas, I walked to town and went to a Mexican restaurant on Soledad Street. I was drinking coffee when I saw the same young girl who had disappeared in the night. She was passing by with an old man. I ran to the door and called to her, but she did not hear me. I went back to my coffee, wondering what would become of her. I avoided the Chinese gambling houses, remembering the tragedy in Stockton. He's gotten in trouble, that's why he's had to leave. Walking on the dark side of the street, as though I were hunted, I returned eagerly to the freight yards. I found the hobos sitting gloomily in the dark. I tried a few times to jump into the boxcars, but the detectives chased me away. When the freights had gone, the detectives left. Then an express from San Francisco came and stopped to pick up a few passengers. The hobos darted out from the dark and ran to the rods. When I realized that I was the only one left, I grabbed the rod between the coal car and the car behind it. Then the express started, gathering speed as it nosed its way through the night. I almost fell several times. The strong, cold wind lashed sharply at my face. I put the crook of my arm securely about the rod, pinching myself when I feared that I was going to sleep. It was not yet autumn, and the sky was clear, but the wind was bitter and sharp and cut across my face like a knife. When my arm went to sleep, I beat it to life with my fist. It was the only way I could save myself from falling to my death. I was so exhausted and stiff with a cold. When I reached San Luis Obispo, I could hardly climb down. I stumbled when I reached the ground, rolling over on my stomach as though I were headless. Then I walked to town where I found a Filipino who took me in his car to Pismo Beach. The Filipino community was a small block near the sea, a block of pool rooms, gambling houses, and little green cottages where prostitutes were doing business. At first, I did not know what the cottages were, but I saw many Filipinos going into them from the gambling houses nearby. Then I guessed what they were, because cottages such as these were found in every Filipino community. I went into one of the cottages and sat in the warm little parlor where the Filipinos were waiting their turn to go upstairs. Some of the prostitutes were sitting awkwardly in the men's laps, wheedling them. Others were dancing cheek to cheek, swaying their hips suggestively. The Filipinos stood around, whispering lustily in their dialects. The girls were scantily dressed, and one of them was nude. The nude girl put her arms around me and started cooing lasciviously. I was extricated from her by the same Filipino who had taken me into his car in San Luis Obispo. He came into the house and immediately took the girl upstairs. In 10 minutes, he was down again. That was fast. I was like, what? What'd you do up there? And asked me if I would like to ride with him to Lompoc. I had heard of the place when I was in Seattle, so naturally I was interested. We started immediately, and in about 2 hours had passed through Santa Maria. Beyond the town at a railroad crossing, highway patrolmen stopped our car. Speaking to me in our dialect, Doro, my companion, said, "These bastards probably want to see if we have a white woman in the car." "Why?" I asked him, becoming frightened. "They think every Filipino is a pimp," he said. "But there are more pimps among them than among all the Filipinos in the world put together. I will kill one of these bastards someday." They questioned Doro curtly, peered into the car, and told us to go on. I came to know afterward that, in many ways, it was a crime to be a Filipino in California. I came to know that the public streets were not free to my people. We were stopped each time these vigilant patrolmen saw us driving a car. I'm getting really emotional. We were suspect each time we were seen with a white woman, and perhaps it was this narrowing of our life into an island, into a filthy segment of American society, that had driven Filipinos like Doro inward, hating everyone and despising all positive urgencies toward freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Next, we have Hua Hsu, who will talk about The Hanging on Union Square by H.T. Hsiang. So Hua is a member of the board at the Asian American Writers Workshop, as well as a contributor to The New Yorker and a professor at Vassar. And his first book, A Floating Chinaman, is actually sort of about H.T. Hsiang. And one thing I discovered is if you Google Hanging on Union Square H.T. Hsiang, the first page is almost all AWW stuff that we've done around this, including an excerpt from Hua's book, I think, and the event that we did, at which I learned that part of his scholarly interest derived from thinking about H.T. Hsiang in the context of hip-hop rap battles, where you mercilessly attack other writers. H.T. Hsiang's Hanging on Union Square is sort of probably the weirdest book that was recently uncovered in the rediscovery of Asian American past. It's probably the only book that is a proletarian, avant-garde, oddball novel written by an undocumented communist who also thought he was a member of Frank Sinatra's Rat Pack. Let's give a hand to Hua.
Hey everyone, can you hear me? Cool. I too, I want to thank the staff of the workshop, John and Elda at Penguin, the folks at Kaya Press who originally reprinted this. This is a really cool event. it's really weird as well that this is Ken's last event. I was just sitting there reflecting on the first event I did with the workshop. Ken has like a lot of really weird visions, and I remember I had to moderate this discussion, and I didn't quite understand why I was the right person to do it, but the person I was talking to was really rambling, as I will be doing shortly, but in a way that seemed really kind of unnerved, like his center of gravity was sort of slowly evaporating, and it was really hard to talk to. And I looked in his eyes at one point, and I realized that he and his friends had taken ecstasy before the event, and that it was hitting right as we got on stage. And I just thought, wow, Ken, you've put me in a lot of strange positions over the past 10 years, but I'm really going to miss you and your vision, and I'm glad you'll be able to share it with other people. I think I left during the event, and the guy didn't notice at all. Now, one thing that Ken and I like talking about a lot, much to the boredom of many people around us, is like what life was like before the internet in the 90s. And I think when I was in college, I had this. I had convinced myself that I had read every Asian American book ever written, because you couldn't figure out what else was out there. Like, it was just whatever was on your syllabus was sort of the scope of your imagination. And I think what was really sad about that, thinking about it, was just sort of realizing the histories of some of these books, and how, for example, No No Boy was just rediscovered by a bunch of sort of people like us who were really interested in finding Asian American stories, who would just come across it at a secondhand bookstore. And it was always sort of in my instinct to look, like go to thrift shops, go to record stores, go to used bookstores, just sort of search for things that may or may not have actually been there. And it's really fascinating to be here kind of inaugurating these writers into the sort of hallowed world of Penguin Classics, which is incredible. Like, it's sort of like, as I was sitting there, I thought that this would magically sprout like a used sticker, because it's just so canonical to see Penguin Classics books everywhere. It's like they're just always around, right? And I think what's really powerful about this for me is, as Ken pointed out, like I'm going to talk a lot because this book's actually not that easy to jump into. It's very weird, but I picked 4 pages that hopefully will give you a taste of it. But what's fascinating about Asian American history and just sort of immigrant history in general is just that a lot of it is fragmented, it's pieced together, it's sort of something that we have to kind of improvise in retrospect, because a lot of this was produced by people who didn't necessarily think of themselves as sort of like worthy of self-archiving. A lot of what survives more out of a sense of like immigrant hoarding, or something like that. And that was certainly the case with Hsiang. Like, I discovered him in the early 2000s. Ironweed Press, which was like a really small press that Floyd Chung was involved with, reprinted In China Has Hands, his slightly more famous novel. And once I realized that there was this whole world of sort of literature written in the 30s and 40s, literature that often doesn't actually anticipate anything of the present. Like, a lot of what Hsiang does has very little bearing on sort of how we understand identity or political struggle today. But I just became sort of addicted with the idea of finding more like material things in Hsiang's orbit. So as I quickly created like an HT Hsiang saved search on eBay, like I went to used bookstores looking for his stuff. And what was really fascinating was I began collecting all of his books in their original sort of hardcover edition, and the covers were really odd. He would print all of these negative blurbs, or like lukewarm blurbs on the back. He would print rejection slips inside his book, and then sort of in the footnotes respond to them. Every copy I got was autographed, because it seemed as though he would just harass people around Union Square and force them to buy his book. And it just became like so tragic to me that that it was impossible to find more information about this guy. Like, he was really interesting. As you can read in my book, if you ever want to read it, he was actually being read this whole time, but it was actually by FBI agents and immigration authorities who thought that he was actually as radical as he claimed to be. Now, Hsiang is a really interesting figure to be sort of seen as a classic, because he himself rejected all forms of kind of like identity. Like, he probably wouldn't have understood what an Asian American is. he didn't necessarily kind of associate with other Chinese Americans in the way that we might sort of seek community and belonging today. So he was a lot ambivalent about a lot of categories of identity, but one thing that he wasn't ambivalent about was fame. And so I think he really wanted to figure out a way for his voice to be heard. Like, he was very much a person who was always trying to kind of harangue and shout and catch the attention of anyone who would pass by. Oftentimes by saying like incredibly weird things. And so he actually self-published this book with the help of some friends who owned a restaurant, who would give him brandy and sort of give him $20 every now and then. But this book takes place over the course of a couple days. Depression-ravaged New York. It's about a guy named Mr. Nutt, who is just sort of wandering the streets. At the beginning of the book, Mr. Nutt is pretty idealistic. He just sees himself as someone who has not yet sort of made it. So this is the beginning. Everybody there called him comrade. Comrade this, comrade that. To people in the communist cafeteria, Mr. Nutt wasn't Mr. anymore. It didn't please him. For how could they take for granted so much that he was their comrade, a communist? Sometimes they called Mr. Nutt fellow worker. That made him madder still. How could they know that he was a worker? Did they not see that he had a black derby on? Yes, he was a worker, now, for the time being. But how could they tell that he would not someday, by saving some money, establish a business of his own? In the communist cafeteria, there were so many literature agents, so many pamphlet salesmen, so many contribution seekers, one after the other. If a panhandler came to you, all you needed was to show him your face. He would go away. No argument. But these agents, salesmen, contribution seekers gave you more trouble than panhandlers. Why? Because, they said, they themselves would get nothing out of it. Every cent would go to the cause. Was it true? Yes, it was true. For all these sealed tint boxes with coin spaces at the tops, and the contribution lists were their spokesmen. Besides, they wouldn't ask you to buy or to contribute right away. They just sat at your table and made friends with you, and explained things to you. A few seconds or a minute later, the boxes, the pamphlet, and the contribution list appeared from some unseen source. With your hand, you said, I won't give, but your conscience said, I must do my share. And you lost money. On the wall, there was a sign, don't shout so loud. Your comrades can hear you. Mr. Nutt thought, if the communists don't shout, how can they make a revolution? So Nutt pretty much just has to, it's like a video game where he has to just sort of traverse New York City, but people keep bothering him, people keep trying to get things from him. At one point, this guy, who he describes as a pest, starts trying to get him to buy a book called China Red, which is actually Zhang's previous novel. So Zhang actually shows up in the novel as a pest, who's arguably one of the most pathetic characters in a book full of pretty down on their luck folks. So this is a section where Nutt ends up meeting a poet. The poet says, you know, you don't have anywhere to go, are you hungry? Like, why don't you just come over to my place? You can hang out for a bit. He says, no thanks, I never liked poetry, I cannot understand it. To which the poet responds, because it is not understandable, that is why it is poetry. If you could understand it, then it wouldn't be poetry anymore. If you want to read something as plain as autumn air, you should go to Union Square and read some of their propaganda stuff. So they just sort of have this weird back and forth, at the conclusion of which Nutt actually gets some bread, and this is what happens after he eats. Nutt stood up and ran his hands up and down his chest to help his stomach get things straightened out. Then he stretched his hands and had a little exercise. And he left the sofa and had a little walk. He went into the washroom and had a few glasses of cold water. Then everything was all right. He was a new man. He began to smile. He thanked God for his daily bread. He felt that in this world there was a certain person who had a good heart. While Nutt was eating, drinking, walking, the young fellow was standing alongside of a table looking at a picture of a middle-aged woman. It was inscribed, to my dear son, from his lonely and affectionate mother. The air in the room made Nutt sleepy. He lay on the sofa with his legs stretched out and his body relaxed. He slept. As he lay sleeping, the young fellow sat on the arm of the sofa and was running his hand through Mr. Nutt's hair. The young fellow kissed Nutt's forehead, cheeks, and lips. And because of the touching and kissing, and because of the strong perfume of that young fellow, Mr. Nutt awoke. The young fellow looked at him with his eyes mysteriously half closed. He didn't say a word. Nut felt that something was wrong. He stood up, put on his hat and overcoat. Thanks a lot for your bread. The young poet was disappointed and finally saying, I wish your taste would be like mine. We could just be 69. So Nut eventually sort of has this moment where he understands that the struggle is something that he should be a part of, and that all throughout the novel he has sort of looked down on sort of socialist revolt around him, and he finally realized that he is his life is sort of as hopeless as anyone else's. There's these people who kind of run everything in this world named Mr. System and Mr. Wise Guy. There's also a character named Miss Stubborn and Miss Gold Digger. So this is a very, very textured work. So eventually, Mr. Nut enters into this strange arrangement with Mr. Wise Guy, and Mr. Wise Guy, reading an item in the newspaper about how sort of destitution and poverty had led to higher surging suicide rates in New York City, has this idea for how to monetize suicide in New York City of the working man. And so Mr. Nut has agreed to be part of a public hanging. Again, the phone. Mr. Wise Guy answered it this time. And news of Mr. Nut's willingness to participate in this scheme leads to all these sponsorship opportunities. This is the World Newspaper Syndicate calling. We want Mr. Nut to write his autobiography in 100,000 words. It must be completed in 45 minutes so we can telegraph it to our papers throughout the world for immediate printing. Our representative will be down any minute. It can't be done, replied Mr. Wise Guy. The time is too short. The syndicate answered, we have plenty of autobiographies and biographies on hand. What we'll do is change the name dog to beast or cat to rat. That is all. The phone rang. Mr. Nut took the call. I'm the president of the biggest institution of learning in the world. Because we are the biggest, we are the best. The point of my words to you, however, nonetheless, is academically unacademic. May I have the honor of offering to you the highest degree of our institution? PhD, LLB, MMC, YYZ? If you can present our institution with an endowment, we shall build a nut hall in which we shall teach the unemployed the trade of how to hang profitably. So, as the book ends, Nut is walking up to the gallows, and this is sort of like the penultimate paragraph. You should read it yourself and see what happens. Nut now overalls are coming. Unite, fight. All right, but let him only say a few words, said Mr. Wise Guy to Mr. System. Our people like action. Nut now spoke. I am a forgotten man, a little man, an average man, a worker, a nut. Be good and starve is the order of the day. Prey on others or become a prey. I was a nut, but I'm a nut no more. I, a forgotten man, a little man, an average man, a worker, will this time double-cross you, Mr. System, the exploiter, the war maker, the man-killer. Here is your neck. This is your rope. Thanks.
So now we're going to do the Oprah's Book Club segment. So feel free to start thinking about questions in advance. So Jessica and Alex, feel free to come on up. Why don't we give all three writers a hand before we start? So I've been thinking about these 4 books and maybe thinking about writing about them or thinking about like what is the role of us reading them now, which I think the 3 of you have been thinking about too. And I guess I wanted to talk about like the ghosts of Asian American past and future. You know, there's this famous debate that the Black Marxist Adolf Reed is engaged in, where someone quotes I've already lost audience. Someone quotes W.B. Du Bois. To
Tell us
him.
more.
Well, since you asked, someone quotes W.B. Du Bois to him as a great African American left leader or intellectual, W.B. Du Bois, and then Adolph Reed has this response that blew my mind when I read it, where he said, "I don't think W.B. Du Bois was African American, because the way that he might be African American is very different than the way that someone living in the Reconstruction or whatever." Might be. And so I think there's a way where the phrase Asian American is similarly meaningless, and probably out of any ethnic label, it's the one that's the most fragmented, the most not naming of a natural organic narrative of a race, And I guess I mean, to speak more personally, I kind of remember being a teenager in the California school system, and reading these books that are when I was 15 or something, that are kind of about this very different age of Asian American identity, where it's gold miners in California, gold diggers and gold miners, and just not relating to it, because I just these people were not Asian American, or I wasn't Asian American, or something. I wasn't Asian American.
I had a similar reaction because I hadn't grown up in the U.S. So I had to kind of wrap my head around this history and slowly get into it as a young person, because I knew it was significant and would make me understand myself, but it was so complex. And, I had this thing well, this is not, what are you also, upset about? I mean, really, I had this anger and then this strange reaction if I better catch up with it and connect it to where I came from. But yeah, there's that too. I mean,
I'm thinking of the way in which Carlos Bulosan was inspired by Younghill Kang, for example. That to me is Asian American culture.
And it's Asian American culture that they would not have named themselves doing.
Exactly. And I think that's, that's part of the power of these texts now in this series. I'm looking forward to reading the Bulosan with the context of imagining him having read East Goes West and thinking about what he would write, I think the other piece that I found really interesting about, that I would comment on in relationship to that, is, reading East Goes West and thinking about what it was like writing a novel at the time when Asian American wasn't a context, or Asian American fiction wasn't a context, or even he has these sort of weird parts of the novel where he speaks to the reader as if the reader, of course, is white, with the expectation
explaining
that
Korea.
Yeah, explaining Korea, explaining these things, and it's not that he's thinking that no Korean Americans will ever read it, but it's he's in this particular mind space, and so I think that also is a really significant part of the reading experience of the book. Explaining a country that he thinks is dead, and a culture that he thinks is dead too.
Hua, you were saying that you felt like there's little in the book that was relevant today, or that...
No, I think I totally misspoke. It's very relevant, but I just mean a lot of what he was trying to do was on this scale that's very different from writing, kind of knowing that you have a community, or knowing that you have this sort of container that is your identity, because he was really trying to kind of foment revolution. All of his books are basically about that. And so until he then went to Hollywood and became an actor. But a lot of his...
What? Really?
Yeah.
Do you want to describe that for 1 second?
Yeah.
Because it's
Sure.
it's
I'm sorry. I just feel like this is
everything was
my
weird,
bit.
but this is
Yeah.
your bit.
This
This
is,
is the weirdest part, even though everything else he said was weird.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So also, I just want to quickly shout out my students, past and present, who I see here. But one of the things that really motivated Hsiang was that he really hated Pearl Buck, and he hated the sort of white establishment who was writing about China in the 1930s. And so, but he didn't really read it, I think, the way we would read publishing politics through the lens of sort of like race or identity politics today. Like he just had this sort of unfocused, like coarse anger. And so he would make characters who would make fun of Pearl Buck, or he would make characters who were the less successful cousins of Pearl Buck's characters in The Good Earth. And he just really despised her. And he eventually ended up like almost publishing a book with her husband. And then there was this whole kind of slapstick moment where he told her husband, no, wait, I have different edited versions of the book minus all of the Buck slander to send to you. Eventually, though, he went to Hollywood and he kind of reset his politics a bit and became a bit actor in like a lot of TV shows. He's in Ocean's 11, the original Ocean's 11. And he also ended up acting in movies that had been written by Pearl Buck, which always struck me as one of the strangest kind of
The most
indignities.
pathetic.
Yeah. But I'm sorry, what was the question?
Wow,
Oh,
I
yeah.
mean, this is so surreal.
It's very weird,
Yeah.
which is why I'm so into it. But I think going back to what you were saying a few minutes ago about the kind of amorphous kind of quality of Asian American identity and just sort of how it's like unfixed, I think that's something that we lament in a way, but I think it's also really powerful, right? Because it just means that there are opportunities to reanimate it around different energies or different possibilities. I mean, that's what makes this so cool, that there is this move toward taking people who were really not recognized in their time and aren't always recognized even within sort of like Asian American literature. And now they've sort of been like elevated to status. And so it'll be interesting to see people for whom these are canonical works, like what they do with that. Like, will they think that these works aren't that good? Or will they think these works aren't experimental enough? Like, I think that's...
Who are the they?
I mean, younger people for whom
Where this is normal.
this is just like a normal book. Like a Penguin Classics edition of Bulosan is like not that big of a deal. Whereas in my mind, it's sort of truly mind-blowing.
Yeah, and I feel like there's like a lot of, I mean, I feel like we're talking about the past, but like what is the future of the past, you know? And like a lot of the things we're describing, like the future reader reading Bulosan, or the way that Bulosan read, you know, East Goes West. It is like the kind of thing where it's related to this space, and that, you know, you're like, all of us have met close friends through this space. We are like the future audience that, you know, someone like Bulosan would never have imagined. You know, so I guess that's kind of going back to trying to imagine these books not as like things that are in the canon out there in some abstract way, but like things that are these curatorial interventions to say, you know, we don't have an Asian American nationalism, but what we can have are these like specific, you know, curatorial things where we go, that is Asian American in an interesting way. But I mean, to go back to one thing that struck me about all three of these novels that may be less Asian American is there's a way where they struck me as actually very useful for the present, in that we're kind of in a radical moment with like the rise of Bernie, Elizabeth Warren, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, mass unionization, the DSA. There's sort of like the rise of what someone jokingly on Twitter called the new old left. And all three of these writers were like writing in this moment of like the cultural front where, you know, it was about being a migrant farm worker, you know, or being a wait staff at a restaurant, or a domestic worker, or, you know, being like a homeless person, you know. And so in that way, it seemed like there is like a useful present that can be brought out. But I would say that this is a present that is not really similar to post-65 Asian American literature, where you often have characters who are middle class, who are lawyers, or the books are written by Asian American writers who are lawyers or doctors or whatever, where there's a real class shift. And I was wondering, like, what, if that jumped out to you, like, what do you think are useful politics that can be taken out of the books for, like, the moment now?
Well, I mean, that's what blew me away about rereading this book, and also really thinking about Bulosan, the man, and all he endured in the Philippines, he and his family losing everything, and, you know, going to school barefoot and being called names by the kids in his village, and then becoming the writer he became because he was so thirsty. I mean, cliche, but it's true. There's this real desire. He loved to read, and you could feel this sort of writer coming out of him, you know, growing in him. And then he goes to the United States, you know, with the dream in his head, you know, of what, you know, the illusion we were all fed, right? And he quickly learns the hard way. I think what he's writing, and especially because it's written so beautifully, as I hope I did it a little bit of justice, but that history is not taught to us. I mean, I went to high school in California, and I mean, that all that stuff about the race conflicts and the way everyone was treated. I mean, the reason I still get so emotional, and forgive me, but no, don't forgive me. I mean, it's a good thing, right? It just, because that was so new to me then, finding out how Filipinos were even lower than the Mexicans. I mean, it just, and these are all people I'm growing up around in high school, and I'm thinking, what is going on with this country? And, you know, I got educated fast. And I think this knowledge is essential for everyone today because it has not changed. I mean, the conversation is about one thing, but all these other layers, it's not like that's gone away. Hello. You know, so to me, it feels very fresh and very vivid and very significant. And it's what we're living in right now. I mean, maybe certain characters have changed, you know, so maybe the focus is on another kind of racism, but excuse me, the thing with the Mexicans, I mean, you know, so how we're pitted against each other and live together, and he struggled with all of that and somehow rose above it each time, even when he was being treated, you know, the way he was treated, and continued to write. That's what kills me. And then the fact that the New Yorker published him, I think that is so far out. Back in those days, you know, that always, I couldn't quite fit that in my head.
Because we're always being asked to imagine that we're the first.
Right.
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 Like, no, it's never happened before. We're supposed to be so grateful for any opportunities that come our way. And what's powerful about reading these books is to see we were not the first. We were here. We were erased. We were ignored. And that's one of the radical contexts that the books provides.
I think so.
And, you know, for me, like, thinking about East Goes West specifically, you know, there's this he does a lot in it to make his struggle, the Chung Pao Han's struggles, really funny. You know, so there's like a scene where where George is like, okay, we're gonna get you a job, and he like gets a job and as a kind of a butler in these white people's house, and he's terrible at it, and he keeps screwing everything up, and they're getting increasingly angry at him, and he's just kind of like really trying to imagine, like, is this what success looks like? And he keeps thinking about how George was telling him how much Cooks made, you know, and throughout it all, as I was reading it, I was thinking about the struggle, what I had read about Kang's struggle with his editor, who was also Tom Wolfe's editor, the earlier Thomas Wolfe, who was a friend of his, and they were adjunct professors at NYU together, which is like such an experience that I think everyone, we're not everyone in this room, but like many people in this room know, if you're a writer. And Wolfe had introduced Kang to his editor, and his editor kept saying, like, well, you know, you have this nice life where you've married a Western woman, and you're a translator, and you teach English literature at NYU. Like, why are you writing about this? And Kang was just like he kept trying to make East Goes West into an autobiography that would say something better about the immigration experience. And Kang was really committed to saying, like, there's a way in which many people are driven into the ground by how this country treats them. and that's what this novel is about, and that's why this isn't in there. You know, he was really determined not to let his book become a way of excusing the treatment of Asian Americans at that time. And he also had a lot of solidarity with African Americans as well, who he writes about in the book.
I really enjoyed, Mr. Nutt, by the way. I was just thinking about how avant-garde the whole thing was, you know.
I should know this. 1935.
What?
I think. It's in the book. It's in the book.
Yeah, I thought it was like the 60s.
No, he was pretty early on the kind of ironic self-deprecation.
Very meta,
I can't wait to read the Pearl Buck stuff.
It's pretty wild once you get there. I think one of the things, when you're talking about sort of the radical politics then and now, I think one of the things that has always fascinated me about Hsiang is that he really tried to be, down with the cultural front, down with the sort of new masses crowd, but he wasn't. He didn't really find it to be a hospitable space, and I've always found that really fascinating. Like it's like he wouldn't have minded, at least it seems, to be like fetishized in that way as sort of like the Chinese left. And yet there were already people who were writing about that stuff who, usually weren't Chinese. And I think he turned that sense of, he was able to see the sort of like sociology of the left in a way that was like really interesting. And so in a lot of his books, he's really critical of like his fellow travelers and sort of the ways in which they're also beholden to, market ideologies, or there's like a cool crowd, or like a sort of way in which it's very cliquish, at least in his view. And so I've always found that to be such a strange vantage for someone to write from, because ultimately he ends up embracing those ideals. Even though he thinks everyone around him is just sort of like posturing in a way, like he still ends up kind of pushing himself to try and find a form, find literary style that can accommodate this like wildly global ambition. I don't know that he completely succeeds, but it's always struck me that the scope of his ambition is so different than what I'm capable of imagining.
As you were reading from the passages from his book, I started thinking about Frank Chin and his sardonic sense of humor. It sort of came through, and I thought, well, how do I haven't read my copy yet, so I didn't know where this was going, but there was something about the voice that felt a lot like Frank's early plays.
The plays, yeah.
Yes,
definitely.
yes.
It's funny, when I was hearing it, I was thinking, it kind of reminded me of Ishmael Reed.
Sure.
That same kind of like...
It's that school of, yeah. I don't want to call it satire at all. It's more way out, than that. There's something, the hoodoo thing, yeah. Maybe people have...
Yeah, so I think maybe it'll be time to take questions from the audience. I can ask a buffer question if you're too shy, but feel free. Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Everybody, give a thumbnail of that.
So the fourth book is John Okada's classic No-No Boy, and who here raise your hand if you know what that means? Okay, so some of you know what that means, but during World War II, you had to pledge allegiance to the United States government if you were Japanese American by saying yes twice to I forget what the two yeses are. You pledge allegiance to the country.
Would you fight?
Would you fight? Yeah. So if you said no twice, you were no boy, which means that you were loyal to the evil Japanese Empire and not to America, and then you were put in concentration camps, as this country does. And so John Okada's book...
Well, no, everyone was already in the internment camp, so you were just you were just imprisoned.
Yeah. So your situation was already a carceral situation. So No Boy is about... John Okada himself was not a no boy, but it's I think it's actually a great novel to read, to imagine it as a post 9/11 novel, because it's sort of like you read it and you're like, oh, this really reminds me of like the Patriot Act or contemporary surveillance happening now, Islamophobia. I mean, not in the way they profile mosques now that U.S. government used to profile like Buddhist temples, because Buddhism is a religion of violence, just like Islam is now. But what's amazing about the novel is it has this sort of like beatnik, like Mad Men film noir, like alcoholic.
It's also very, it's
Kind of vibe.
what Bulosan, I was trying to say, in spite of everything going on around him and how he was treated and everything he suffered, somehow the rage, I don't know, he tamped it down, or he was just so, I can't believe this man never felt that kind of outrage or rage, just rage. But Okada's is a novel of rage. You can feel it from the first page, and it simmers. It's a very simmering novel.
It is a very simmering novel.
Yeah. It's a great book. Yeah. I highly recommend it.
There's this really sad story where, it didn't achieve the fame that he'd always wanted for it, and so it was rediscovered by Frank Chin and Sean Wong and some other sort of early Asian
very
American
frank.
editors. Yeah, and they found it, and then
The anger.
they found his wife, and they sort of, I could be misremembering some of it, but it's sort of like they got there just too late. Like Okada had just died, and he had been so frustrated by his lack of success that he had burned all of his manuscripts and all of his other writings, and so it was just tragedy compounded by tragedy.
Other questions? I mean, one thing that strikes me about all of these, the anger and people being kind of like never getting their due, because they're outcasts in America. Like, I feel like a lot of these books are about the American part of Asian American. Like, what does it mean to be American? What does it mean? Is America really like a free country? It seems like with Bulosan, Okada, and with Kang, there's a sort of like ambition of citizenship that is thwarted by, and so you can sublimate it into comedy, or you can,
Right.
go full rage and despair on it.
I think I would just make the point that in the case of Kang, who won a Guggenheim twice in his career, he actually had a kind of literary success that I think separates him from some of these other writers in terms of mainstream institutional success. And his books were still treated as autobiography. The novel was not treated as a novel. It was not discussed as a novel. And then he was erased. So it's a kind of important act to resuscitate him now, in that sense, I think. But it's also important to acknowledge as well that even with the success that he had, this way of, and this is what I think is
Patronizing.
the patronizing, but also like that way in which autobiographical fiction is somehow dismissed if you are a person of color, but if you are a white writer, it somehow makes you more authentic. That's the kind of thing that, it still goes on.
Come on now, I know you're all burning with curiosity, and I don't know, maybe we talk too much. Just burning, perhaps.
Idle thoughts, things. Yes.
Ben Santos.
I think I'd also say that there's plans for more.
Yeah.
These are not the only
Yeah.
4 that are being
Yeah.
brought out. These are just the first 4.
But wait a minute, don't the Nick Joaquin and the
Yeah, there's a
Jose
bunch of other-
Rizal, oh, but they're not Asian American. You see what I mean?
But there's Richard
They're
Kim,
Phil-
The Martyred, which
you
was, I
go.
think, a National Book Award winner. Was it a winner or finalist? National Book Award winner by a Korean American author that is also erased from history.
So that's already out.
That was published a few years ago by Penguin Classics.
Yeah.
But what are books that you feel like are forgotten Asian American classics? And there are a lot of them.
Well, I'm a big fan of Ben's.
Do you want to talk a little bit about
Yes,
Ben Santos's work?
Bienvenido Santos, and also NVM Gonzalez, but I feel like Santos is a much more, what am I going to say? I don't mean to put them together, but they were friends, you know, and they were writing at the same time, and I just find Ben's stories very accessible in the best way and very Chekhovian, and they're about being here and being kind of lost, but coming from a little slightly more privileged place, coming here as a student, and they're incredible. They're beautiful stories, and they're very bittersweet. There's a real bittersweet thing running through all of them, and they're funny, but they're sad. And there's a classic called Immigration Blues, and he had this wonderful sense of humor, but it was always tinged with, you know, masking the pain. And he had a way of doing that was very special. I just think very few people know about him, really. And he lived here for, you know, a long time. He died in Colorado. He taught at in Pullman, Washington, and he was a great teacher, apparently, and just a lovely man, humble man. So perhaps so humble that nobody really knew who he was, you know. And University of Washington Press did put out his stories, but it's not like they promote those books. You know, they're put out, but, you know, you have to know that they're there, and it would be great if those writers in their series got more attention. So that's, you know, he's one that immediately comes to mind. And I don't know about Sui Sun Far or, you know, who else did Sean Wong tell me about? I mean, he's like a walking encyclopedia of those early writers, because I did not know them when I came here. Diana Chang,
Yeah.
short story writer, also very graceful, very subtle.
Sean Wong's Home Base is kind of a cool novel. It's kind of no boy-ish,
Mhm.
very dude oriented in that way. I started reading
But
this
do you
book
have to
recently.
be dead? Where's Elda and John? Do you have to
They're
be
right.
dead to be in the
No, because
Penguin?
Morrissey has
Morrissey.
one. Yeah.
Because maybe Sean would not want to be a Penguin
Right.
classic yet.
Well, I just started reading this book, Mulberry and Peach. Have you ever read it?
You were mentioning.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and I think it speaks to one of the tensions inherent to Asian American literature is that it's very transnational. It's about this woman who, I think she like went through the White Terror in Taiwan, and then she comes to the United States and is sort of reflecting on the trauma of that experience, and then this other character emerges in the text, and part of the puzzle for the reader is figuring out like what these two characters have to do with one another. It's very beautiful and kind of experimental, and I think it actually did pretty well when it was first published in the early 80s, but it's very obscure. It's very cheap on Abe if you want to read it, but it's called Mulberry and Peach. I think it's definitely another book like like Dictee that I think it just becomes more interesting the more time passes, because there's different ways of engaging and sort of trying to understand the larger project there.
I was kind of serious about my question. If Elda or John want to address, you know, because Sean's novel Home Base does need more attention. I mean, that came out and sort of, you know, what, in the 70s? Yeah. But I mean, he's a living, breathing writer. But how do you? I mean, what constitutes? Yeah, I'm serious. Yeah, sort of. It's a case by case. So it could be Home Base. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So there. So
Heard of it?
he could be.
Any other questions?
Yes. In the white shirt. What's the first Asian American book that you all read? Really?
Yeah.
That's cool.
That's a good start. Yeah.
Yeah. And I wouldn't have called it an Asian American novel. When I read it, that didn't even exist. Just
think
this
Woman
Filipino
Warrior.
guy. Oh, I read that too, but yeah. Read this first, so,
How old were you when you read Woman Warrior?
I think I was 19 or 20. I was a Wesleyan, and I don't think of Dictée as a novel. I wouldn't, but I had come across. I had read This Bridge Called Your Back, which is this anthology of radical women's writing, and found Teresa Hak-Young Cha that way, and then somehow I ended up with a copy of Woman Warrior. And that blew my mind. And then I kept following Kingston for a while. Chinamen, I think, is a really underrated book that's really powerful, which if you haven't read it, it's Kingston imagining her way into the silences of the men in her family who won't talk about about their experience of coming to the U.S., and so she uses research to try to imagine, fictionalize what their experience might have been, and she goes through these different scenarios getting there. And so it's a nonfiction book that uses fiction quite seriously and openly and directly.
My mom used to buy me like biographies all the time for some reason, so I feel like I read a lot of Asian American biographies as a kid, like Ben Fong Torres and just, My Life in Chinatown kind of books. But I think the first, like, Woman Warrior was also the one for me where I thought this is so difficult, and it's so capacious, and it's sort of, there's so many different ways to enter into this that I think that was really eye-opening. And then that led me to Tripmaster Monkey, one of Kingston's other novels, which I absolutely love. And if any of you become like really rich and successful, want to make a movie with me, I've always wanted to see Tripmaster Monkey adapted into a film. But it's really fascinating because it's sort of Kingston also reflecting on what it means to be successful, because the character in the book is trying to stage this production that's sort of impossible and deal with the criticism that comes afterwards. And so it was just fascinating to read something that was that sort of articulated a struggle against expectations of like success, which was kind of a different vantage.
Maybe let's do one last question and then we'll wrap things up.
Oh, yeah,
Shinhee?
here.
Wow. Yeah. I'd moderate that.
So for the live stream listeners, the question is if Bulosan, Kang, and Hsiang were on the couch being such, crazy characters with rich voices, what would they be saying right now?
I bet they'd have a good time talking about how they even managed to have books published and that struggle. Because each of them seems to have had a very particular road, and they could hopefully laugh about it Did Carlos ever laugh? That's what I wonder. Oh my God. He suffered so much. You know what I mean? I mean, I think that could be a rich conversation. And they'd look at this place and they'd go, what? WTF? What is this? You know, look at this. I mean, it's quite amazing.
Amplified sound.
But that's a great question and imagining sort of thing. I don't know. What do you think? What would they talk about? Their struggles, their journey to America, of becoming. Yeah, I find it very hard to even call them Asian Americans. And I feel like part of their pain was never feeling. I don't think we should ever get too comfortable being here. By the way, I don't think it's good for your writing. You know.
I mean, I think, I don't know. I think so one thing that I enjoy about Chung Pa Han, the character in East Goes West, is the way that writing is always a part of his adventures. And so, for example, like his friend George Jung's love letters, he, in the very next moment that follows where I pause, he translates that letter into English to George's satisfaction, so George can then use his emergency love letter in English should he decide to, and thus makes himself. It's kind of like how he's singing for his supper. Is this translation that he's always doing? Like when he's, or when, you know, in the scene just previous when he's at the Chinese restaurant and they first present him with a tab, he writes a poem as a way of paying for his meal, which is such a incredibly idealistic artistic act. And the owner comes out and sits down with him and talks to him and like opens a tab for him that he agrees to come back and pay later. So I don't know what he would want to talk about exactly, except maybe I suppose what moves me is the way in which he kept his spirit alive through writing, you know, and the way Chung Pa Han also does, if differently. Like Chung Pa's not being published in the way that he is, and so it's a sort of, yeah, he's a profoundly poetic person who believed in that in this way that sort of transcends whether he's in Korea or in the United States. You know? So he might just want to talk about that, actually. You know.
Song would definitely just encourage everyone to buy his book. In that spirit, I just wanted to self-promote something. I've actually curated a show at the Museum of Chinese America about music and Chinese American life. I have a bunch of flyers that I'll leave up here. So just, you know, being true to Zhang's self-promotion thing.
Well, I will also be selling a floating Chinaman out of the trunk of his car.
That's the name of the book. That's not an actual person. So.
I wanted to thank the three writers, Hua, Jessica, and Alex. I want to thank all the staff and volunteers and interns at the workshop. I also want to thank Elda and John at Penguin Classics. And we have books for sale at the back, so please grab some cheap wine.
We'll sign them.
And these writers who did not write any of the books, but some of them introduced them, will sign. You can sign Carlos Bulosan and confuse people.
I will. His spirit's in me tonight. I'm so sad.
I'll sign anything but a check.
So we'll all cry together over America's history of racial violence, and we'll also drink red wine. So let's give everyone a hand. Buy books.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ken.